Welcome to Politics in the Pub. You're not going to be disappointed, I assure you, but there have been two crises that have occurred in the past week and one in the past 24 hours. Jihad Dib, who was suddenly appointed about a week ago, or a bit more, the Shadow Minister for Education, is actually in Japan. Secondly, Linda O'Brien, who's the principal of Granville Boys High School, has gone down quite seriously ill. So Dr. Remy who is a lecturer in the Faculty of Education, who's done his PhD on the whole question of de-radicalisation, who spent 6 years before that as a school teacher in Mount Druitt, and it's obvious from my 5-minute conversation with Remy that he's right on top of this subject. So Remy is going to kick off and I will follow. Welcome to Politics in the Pub.
Thank you, Stuart, for inviting me to speak to you all tonight. I want to start with a passage from Karl Marx that I recently reread. Now, one thing I love about Karl Marx is that he's actually a very entertaining and funny writer. I think those of you who read him would agree. And Karl Marx, in the preface of the German ideology, is critiquing philosophers like Feuerbach, Bruno, and the premise of Marx's critique is that these German philosophers think that all the world's problems will be solved if you just knock certain beliefs out of people's heads. And he ends the preface with this really funny story. He says, "Once upon a time, a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If they were to knock this notion out of their heads, say by stating it to be a superstition, a religious concept, there would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. His whole life long he fought against the illusion of gravity, of whose harmful results all statistics brought him new and manifold evidence." Now, if Marx was around today, I think he'd have a lot to say about de-radicalisation and the premises of de-radicalisation, which is what I want to talk about tonight. So it's become a particular focal point in Australian public policy, the concern over the radicalisation of young people. This has emerged following the emigration of several young Australians to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The shooting of a civilian police worker in Parramatta in October 2015 by a 15-year-old. Several high-profile cases of high school students allegedly declaring support for this group. Mark Murdoch, the Assistant Commissioner of New South Wales Police and the head of the state's Counter-Terrorism and Special Tactics Command, has given voice to this concern by stating, "We are no longer dealing with people in their 30s, like me, but we're seeing people of much younger ages becoming involved." So in an attempt to address this publicly perceived security threat of young people becoming radicalised, the Australian government has responded by funding a tranche of so-called de-radicalisation programs. And these programs target youth groups, mosques, sporting groups and community organisations. More recently, the Australian government has produced a booklet called Preventing Violent Extremism and Radicalisation in Australia, made famous in social media and pilloried for its linking of alternative music to radicalisation. But there is something serious in this document, and it's the premise that beliefs, and certain beliefs, will cause people to act violently. Radicalisation, according to the document, the Preventing Violent Extremism document, is defined as a process whereby, quote, "a person's beliefs move from being relatively conventional to being radical, and they want a drastic change in society," which would put most people in this room in that category, might I just add. While the booklet rightly points out that it's not necessarily a bad thing and does not mean these people will become violent, it nonetheless makes becoming radical, where people begin to adopt attitudes and behaviours that seek to substantially transform the nature of society and government, is their definition, a problem by linking it onto a spectrum with violent extremism. So the solution put forward in this document is moderation, which is defined as when they change or moderate their beliefs and no longer subscribe to radical ideologies. This is called de-radicalization. Now, I humbly submit, that the push for moderation and social cohesion through de-radicalization are inadequate responses to violence, especially the types of violence inspired by ISIS, because it ignores the political disaffections that the group actually speaks to. So why am I speaking tonight? Well, because I have worked and talked to wonderful people like Linda and now Stuart. But in a paper that I recently wrote, I argued for this point on the basis of a close reading of the sermon that launched the self-declared caliphate by ISIS. The sermon was given by the self-declared caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. I made the argument that the rhetorical strategy deployed by ISIS seeks to actively construct an ummah, a Muslim community, that is loyal to its caliphate by speaking to the social, economic, and political disaffections of Muslims around the world. I will come back to schooling and young people, but let's go on a bit of a detour to see actually what ISIS is trying to sell. But one thing I want to emphasize is that the ummah that ISIS speaks of, or the Muslim community that it speaks of, is not the empirical global Muslim populace as they are, but one that ISIS actually seeks to produce according to its view of the world. So it does this by structuring its rhetoric in two ways. First, by invoking the name of Islam in an attempt to construct a common identity across a diverse global population of Muslims, and tying general exhortations from the Quran to ISIS's particular political project. And secondly, by constructing a global general enemy that is opposed to Islam, the camp of Kufr, as they called it, who is responsible for all the disaffections experienced by Muslims around the world. So this can be detected if you read al-Baghdadi's sermon, where he represents the political disaffections and oppressive states that Muslims encounter in different locales, and he lists China, India, Palestine, Somalia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Caucasus, the Levant, Egypt, Iraq, Indonesia, Afghanistan, the Philippines, Iran, Pakistan, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Central Africa, and Burma as a single global problem. And I quote from the sermon, "Muslims' rights are forcibly seized in the East and the West." End quote. This is then framed through his use of evocative language as an exhortation for the reader or listener to act through the force of arms in allegiance to the ISIS caliphate. Yet, how is a singular enemy set up given the different national jurisdictions under which these grievances are suffered? In order to do this, al-Baghdadi frames the world as divided into two camps, like I already mentioned. The camp of Islam versus the camp of Kufr. Basically, Muslims versus, quote, the camp of the Jews, the Crusaders, their allies, and with them the rest of the nations and regions of Kufr, all being led by America and Russia and being mobilized by the Jews, end quote. Now, the use of the term Kufr to designate all those who are not in the camp of Islam as defined by ISIS is a significant strategic and rhetorical move. Kufr, which means disbelief or ingratitude, the willful refusal to appreciate the benefits that God has bestowed, is a significant concept in Islamic thought and appears in the Quran nearly 500 times. Even so, the meaning of the term is dependent on the context of its use. For example, many pre-modern and modern Islamic reformers tended to see kufr in popular expressions of Islam. By deploying the term kufr to designate a general enemy led by America and Russia and being mobilized by the Jews that oppose the camp of Islam and faith, al-Baghdadi's seeking to condense all the particular grievances that Muslims suffer worldwide into a focal point of antagonism. Here, of course, we can see how it's constructed, right? In the tying of divergent, and in the case of US and Russia, which ties up to the previous, I think, session of these about Russia, but the tying of divergent interests like US and Russia, openly conflicting interests into a globally unified enemy. Having established this overarching and simplified narrative of the problems that Muslims encounter in particular situations, it then presents the ISIS caliphate as a solution, as a type of utopian solution. Interestingly, al-Baghdadi preempts the designation of people who pledge allegiance to ISIS as terrorists. So in his sermon, he actually, in what in literary studies or cultural studies we might call deconstruct the word terrorism. It's actually quite a work of irony that he weaves into his sermon. He redefines terrorism, and he says, being a faithful Muslim, according to ISIS, will entail being labelled as a terrorist. Astutely, though, what al-Baghdadi points out is the politics of that label and how this term is used in very inconsistent and hypocritical ways, he would argue. He goes on to point out that allegiance to ISIS will render someone liable to be labelled a terrorist. However, the oppression of Muslims in places like Burma, the Philippines, Indonesia, Kashmir, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Palestine, Egypt, East Turkestan, Iran, and Central Africa are not considered terrorism. This is an interesting turn in his rhetoric, and he throws to light the conventional assumptions of what constitutes terrorism into relief, not unlike people who critique state terrorism, like Noam Chomsky and others. But in al-Baghdadi's sermon, he uses this for a strategic purpose. Firstly, he's trying to equate being called a terrorist to living a faithful Muslim life in what he calls hostile societies, and non-terrorism with the complicity in the oppression of Muslims. Another important point that he's trying to make is that it demarcates those ISIS considers to be the true Ummah, the true Muslim community, that is, those who are prepared to reject the laws of the places of their residency and be called a terrorist, versus those who are unwilling to do so. This prepares the way for the call to adopt ISIS's political project of establishing a caliphate as the ultimate solution. A caliphate that, to quote al-Baghdadi again, will return your dignity, might, rights, and leadership, end quote. It is important to emphasize that this is a rhetorical strategy, that it neither speaks to a predetermined Muslim community, nor is it a reflection of a political strategy inherent in Islam, unlike what some conservative commentators would suggest. Rather, it is an interpretation of Islam that seeks to tie the name of Islam to a particular political project, and an invitation for politically disaffected Muslims from around the world to participate in this interpretation by identifying themselves with it. What then would an adequate response to ISIS's project entail? Well, to be honest, I don't know. Needless to say, however, it must take into account how ISIS constructs its rhetoric and its narrative. A rhetoric and a narrative that seeks to shape identities and mobilize desires and disaffections. An adequate response should thus both critically engage with the adequacy of its claims and allow for the expressions of such desires and disaffections rather than pathologizing and criminalizing individuals who do so. And this, I argue, is the weakness of the Australian government's current strategies for de-radicalisation, through moderation, which is defined as no longer seeking to change the status quo. For if part of ISIS's appeal, as I've argued, is its linking up of disaffections experienced by Muslims in various contexts into a project for its own purposes, then it is unlikely that a push for moderation will be an effective response because it ignores the political, social, and economic dimensions of such disaffections. Work by Sharam Akbarzadeh, for example, has made a good argument that community-based de-radicalisation programs in Australia fail to account for the attractiveness of violent extremism, which is related to a range of political and socio-economic factors, including disagreement with the direction of foreign policy and the discrepancy of living standards among Muslims and non-Muslims. Islamic extremism, Akbarzadeh says, has a revolutionary appeal for young Muslims which is rooted in its rejection of the status quo and desire to revamp the system. If this is so, then it implies that more spaces, and schools are really important here, for dissent and challenges to the status quo are required. In other words, rather than linking becoming radical with violent extremism, our task really should be to unlink them or delink them. Because if what are considered to be conventional or the nature of society and government, as referred to in the de-radicalisation booklet, if these things are ultimately historically and politically contingent arrangements that make up the status quo, then conflict and dissension over the shape and direction of society is an ever-present possibility. I think a lot of us would share that idea. Rather than seeking to minimize or moderate this, then, a radical contestation should be seen as necessary for the vitality of democracy, with a caveat that contestants see one another as political adversaries whose views should be combated rather than moral enemies to be eliminated through violence or suppression. And this all involves spaces, including schools, for the expression of political anger, for example, aimed at the status quo, the way things are. So more specifically, I submit that a response to ISIS will involve being aware of the political disaffections that it seeks to link up in its project, and create public spaces for these disaffections to be put forward and acted upon as political demands for a radical change in society. For example, a radical change in the direction of foreign policy, or direct domestic policies, or such phenomena as institutional racism. To do so, of course, is not to sympathise with ISIS's radically polarising project. Rather, it is to acknowledge that instances of oppression and suffering experienced by Muslims, for example in Palestine, Egypt, Russia, China, Australia, etc., are a vital ingredient in ISIS's rhetorical strategy for constructing a global enemy that is responsible for all of it, and to which its political project is framed as the only viable solution. For a key condition that leads to the emergence of a movement like ISIS is a situation in which a plurality of unfulfilled demands coexists with a perceived inability or unwillingness of the political system and the social system to address them. And this brings us back to Marx's point against the German idealists. The idea that really the problem is that people believe bad things, and if we get people to believe good things, all the problems will go away. And Marx was right to point out that no, actually that doesn't solve the problem at all. In another one of his texts, the thesis on Feuerbach, he says, after critiquing the Holy Family, we need to critique the earthly family. And what Marx is trying to say is that we need to see that there is a relationship between belief and the social conditions that people live under. The challenge for us then should be fostering spaces in schools and public spaces where young people can be radical in the sense of questioning the status quo, of voicing their concerns and disaffections, and of acting upon them without recourse to violence. Thank you.